I hear the order before I see the guards. Escort her out. Michael says it the way someone announces a minor inconvenience, like asking IT to swap a broken keyboard. His voice carries across the entire floor, which I suspect was intentional. The sound of it stops conversations mid-sentence and turns heads at desks I can see from here. I am standing at my workstation with a printout of the morning's client activity report in one hand. My other hand is reaching for a highlighter. There is coffee in my mug that is still warm. There is a meeting on my calendar in 40 minutes that I helped organize. And 2 security officers are walking toward me. I have been at this company for 12 years. I know both their names. One of them, a quiet man named Garrett, looks at the floor as he approaches. The other holds out the kind of small cardboard box companies keep in supply rooms specifically for moments like this. I look past the guards at Michael, who stands across the room with his arms folded, watching with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing this moment and is pleased with how it is going. I set down the highlighter. I set down the report. And I start packing. Nobody on that floor says a single word. 30-something people, and the room sounds like a library after closing time. I am aware of the silence the entire walk, the careful kind that happens when a group of adults has made a collective decision to pretend something isn't happening. I understand it. I don't hold it against anyone. Fear spreads differently than people expect. It doesn't come in waves. It comes in a sudden stillness, a room full of people calculating risk at the exact same moment and arriving at the same conclusion. Nobody wants to be next. I put the photo from my desk into the box. The one of my daughter at the ocean, squinting into the sun. Then the small blue coffee mug I'd brought from home 3 years ago. A notepad. A charging cable. Michael stays where he is, arms still folded. There is a slight smile on his face. The particular satisfaction of someone who has been planning something and is watching it land exactly as designed. I carry the box with both guards beside me. The elevator doors are at the far end of the floor. I pass every single desk. Nobody looks up. I keep my eyes straight ahead and my expression completely calm. Composure, in a moment like this, is not surrender. It is strategy. I should tell you who I am before I tell you what happened next. My name is Elena Foster. For 12 years I worked as a senior operations analyst at a mid-sized professional services firm. My job was to make sure the most important systems ran the way they were supposed to, and to understand them well enough to catch problems before they became disasters. My supervisor ordered security to escort me out of the building, then his phone rang and everything changed. I was not the kind of employee whose name appeared in press releases. I was the kind whose name appeared in incident reports, but only in the column that said, "Issue resolved." I designed processes. I maintained client systems. I documented risks clearly enough that anyone reading them could understand what would happen if those risks were ignored. My supervisor, Michael Reeves, had been managing our department for 2 years. He was 34 years old and wanted very badly to become a director by 35. He had decided that the fastest path was a significant reduction in departmental operating costs. He had decided that I was a significant operating cost. He had decided, and this was his fatal mistake, that what I did was mostly automated, mostly redundant, and mostly replaceable. He was wrong on all 3 counts. Within 72 hours, the entire organization would understand exactly how wrong. 12 years ago, the job description sounded straightforward. I would manage the operational systems supporting our client accounts, monitoring performance, flagging anomalies, coordinating with technical teams when something needed attention. Standard stuff. The kind of work that looks neat and bounded on paper. What the description didn't capture was what I found when I got there. The systems had been built in layers over years by different people with different priorities. They technically functioned but didn't function cleanly. Processes overlapped. Handoff points between departments ran through informal workarounds nobody had documented. Client-specific protocols existed only in the memory of whoever had managed each account longest. It was the kind of situation where everything worked until something changed, and then it fell apart in ways hard to diagnose if you didn't already know where to look. In my first month, I started writing things down. I mapped every informal process. I documented the workarounds. I wrote out client-specific protocols in language someone new could follow without calling anyone. That wasn't in my job description. But I had a habit built over years of this kind of work. If something was important enough to do, it was important enough to write down. That habit, 12 years later, was going to change everything. The first 2 years were about putting out fires. Systems running on workarounds eventually fail the way workarounds do, quietly and without warning. A client escalation would arrive and we'd spend 3 days reverse engineering what had broken, because nobody had ever written down how the thing was supposed to work. I started fixing that. One process at a time, one document at a time. A client integration here, an escalation protocol there. Slow work, invisible work, the kind that produces results you don't notice because the result is simply that certain problems stop happening. By the end of my second year, the clients on my watch list had stopped escalating. Not because the systems were perfect, because I had gotten good at catching drift before it became failure. I could look at a set of operational metrics and know, usually 4 days in advance, when something was about to go wrong. I say this not to brag. I say it because it matters for understanding what happened later. The knowledge I had built was not in any manual. It lived in the pattern recognition I had developed through years of close attention to specific systems and clients. You can automate a process. You cannot automate 12 years of pattern recognition. Michael never understood that distinction. By my 5-year mark, the department looked different from the outside. Clients renewed. Escalations were rare. Quarterly reviews that used to include sections about operational problems had become sections about wins. Leadership praised the department in all-hands meetings. What I noticed, and should have paid closer attention to, was how institutional memory works inside a department. The people who had been there for the chaos, who remembered what the escalation logs looked like before, gradually moved on. They got promoted, left for other companies, or retired. The people who replaced them arrived to find a department that ran smoothly and assumed it had always run that way. That assumption was easy to make. Nothing about a working system announces the work required to keep it working. The work is in the gaps. In the things that don't happen because someone made sure they wouldn't. When Michael arrived, the department had the kind of quiet success that looks like it needs no maintenance. He looked at that quiet and saw an opportunity. I looked at the same quiet and knew exactly how fragile it was. He was thinking the way a person thinks when they've learned to read a budget but not an operation. I was thinking the way a person thinks when they know what the silence is actually costing. Michael Reeves became my direct supervisor 26 months before the morning of the security guards. His background was in finance and strategic planning. He was smart, organized, and genuinely good at the kind of high-level thinking that impresses people in rooms where decisions get made. He was not good at understanding what he couldn't see. In his first month he scheduled individual meetings with everyone on our team. Mine lasted 40 minutes. He asked good questions and listened well. By the end I thought we had a productive dynamic, someone who understood strategy paired with someone who understood operations. What I didn't fully account for was what he was going to do with what I told him. Michael heard my description of the systems, the client protocols, the documentation I had built, and processed it through a specific frame. What is essential and what is legacy overhead? To Michael, legacy overhead meant expense that had outlived its justification. He looked at 12 years of accumulated operational knowledge and saw 12 years of accumulated cost. He looked at the smooth running of the department and saw a machine that had been over-engineered. The next 26 months were a slow, inevitable drift toward the morning when he decided to demonstrate how lean the machine could actually run. He was about to find out what lean actually meant. The first real sign came 6 months after Michael arrived. He called me in to review what he described as a departmental efficiency framework, a document mapping our operational processes with cost-benefit scores. The inputs were wrong, not dishonestly wrong. Michael had used the data available to him. The problem was that the most important parts of my work didn't appear in those inputs because they had never been formally logged. The quarterly verification I ran to confirm our 3 largest client integrations were calibrating correctly. The weekly check on the approval trigger logic that had a documented tendency to drift. The relationship maintenance with 3 key contacts at our most valuable accounts, calls and emails that weren't billable but were the reason those accounts had never escalated to executive attention. None of that was in his framework. When I pointed this out, he listened carefully. Then he said, "We need to find a way to quantify these things, or we have to treat them as discretionary." Discretionary. That was the word. I wrote it down when I got back to my desk. I saved the document he had shared. I started keeping a more deliberate log. Something had shifted, and I needed a record of it. Over the following months I submitted 4 written documents. Each was produced in response to something Michael had proposed. Each described, in plain and specific language, the operational risks associated with his proposed changes. The first addressed his proposal to reduce the quarterly integration verification from 4 hours to 45 minutes. I described which errors had historically been caught during that process and what those errors would have cost if they had reached clients. The second addressed a proposal to consolidate 2 client-facing protocol guides into one. I explained why the 2 accounts had different protocols, and what would happen if a team member applied the wrong one in a time-sensitive situation. The third and fourth addressed variations of the same question: how much of this is really necessary? My answer was consistent: all of it. Not because I had designed it to be complicated, but because the clients we served had situations that were genuinely complicated, and the work existed to match that complexity. Michael replied to each submission. Professional, brief replies that said essentially nothing. Versions of, "Thanks for this input." I kept copies of his replies. I kept copies of my submissions. I kept everything in a folder backed up to my personal drive. I was not building a case. I was being thorough, the way I had always been. The way Michael described the department to leadership was something I understood only in pieces. A phrase from a colleague here. A word repeated in a different context there. Once, a summary in an all-hands that described our operational function in a way that didn't quite match what I knew it to be. Michael was narrating a version of the department that positioned me as overhead rather than infrastructure. In his version, the systems were mature and largely self-sustaining. The documentation I had built was legacy bureaucracy. The manual checks I ran were unnecessary redundancy in a department that had evolved beyond them. This version was not entirely false. The systems were more mature than they had been. But they were more mature because of the years of work I had put into making them that way, and they required ongoing attention precisely because mature systems drift in ways that young ones don't. The troubling part was not that Michael believed his version. It was that it was a version leadership could easily accept, because stability looks like self-sufficiency from the outside. I was maintaining a system that looked like it didn't need maintenance. I had built an argument against my own existence, without ever intending to. That is the particular trap of invisible work. In the 6 months before the escort, I knew something was coming. Not the specific day, not the security guards. I hadn't anticipated the public staging of it. But the general direction? I had read that clearly for months. The efficiency reviews, the framework, the way my documented concerns were absorbed without response. The quiet drift in how my role was described in team communications. I did not go looking for another job. I still am not entirely sure why. Perhaps I felt that leaving would validate Michael's narrative, that my role was dispensable and I had understood that before he said so. Perhaps I was stubborn. Perhaps I believed the work would eventually speak for itself. What I did instead was document more. I updated my operational logs to be more precise. I added timestamps to things I had previously tracked in my head. I wrote out the rationale for each manual process in language clear enough for someone who had never done this kind of work to understand. I told myself I was being professional. I was also, I think, preparing for exactly what happened on that Thursday morning. The preparation turned out to be the most important thing I did. The day arrived without drama. I came in at my normal time, got coffee from the break room, a habit so ingrained it happened before I was fully awake, and sat at my desk to start the morning the way I had started 10,000 mornings in that building. Michael arrived 40 minutes after I did. I noticed him come in the way I always noticed things. Not out of anxiety but out of the professional habit of situational awareness that develops when you manage systems that can go sideways. He moved through the floor differently that morning. Purposefully, without stopping at the usual desks. He spoke briefly to someone near the front, and something in the body language registered as unusual. Then he walked toward my workstation. He did not sit. He did not ask if I had a moment. In a measured and public voice that carried clearly across the open floor, he informed me that my position was being eliminated effective immediately and that security would escort me from the building while I collected my personal belongings. He said it the way someone reads from a prepared statement, every word in its planned place. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I asked Garrett for the box. In the elevator, on the way down to the lobby, I felt something unexpected. Calm. Not the numb, shock-delayed calm of someone who hasn't processed bad news yet. Genuine calm. The kind that arrives when you have been preparing for something difficult long enough that when it finally comes, your body has already moved through most of the fear. Garrett, the taller security guard, looked uncomfortable. We had talked many times over the years, brief conversations in hallways and by the coffee machine, the kind that accumulate into something real. Sorry about this, he said, without looking at me. I know, I said. Thank you for saying so. We rode in silence for a moment. Then the elevator stopped. Not at the lobby. It stopped at my floor, the doors sliding open to the hallway we had just come from, because someone had pressed the call button. Michael was standing there. His phone was against his ear. For the first time all morning, the expression on his face was not the composed, rehearsed one he had used when he gave the order. It was the expression of a man receiving information he was not prepared for. I did not know yet what the call was. But I knew what that expression meant. Something had shifted. Michael held up one hand, the universal gesture for wait, and the security guards stopped. We stood in the open elevator, doors held by Garrett's arm, while Michael paced in a tight half-circle a few feet away and spoke in a lowered voice still audible enough for me to catch phrases. Understand, but she's already, a pause. We can absolutely arrange, another pause, longer. No, I hear you, but operationally the transition, his voice tightened on that last sentence. Not loudly, Michael was too controlled for that, but in the way voices tighten when a sentence isn't landing as intended. I watched him and thought about the morning client activity report I had been highlighting when all of this started. About the 12-year-old flag I had built into the integration monitoring that I had been meaning to update. About the quarterly calibration review I had been scheduled to run next Tuesday. About all the things that were not in any transition document because there was no transition document, just a box and 2 security guards and an escort to the elevator. Michael lowered his phone. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was the look of a man who needed something from me. That was Harrington Global, he said. He said it quietly, standing close, as though keeping the conversation between us. Which was interesting given that 20 minutes earlier he had announced my termination at full volume in front of the entire floor. Harrington Global was our largest client. They represented between 18 and 23% of the department's total revenue. I had been their primary operational contact for 7 years. I had been in the room for their initial onboarding. I had managed every significant issue their accounts had generated. 3 account managers had been assigned to Harrington during my tenure. I had outlasted all of them. When something important happened, they called me. Michael knew this. It was in the account records. I had flagged client dependency as a risk in one of my 4 written submissions. He had marked it as low priority. They're requesting you for the renewal discussion on Thursday, he said. A multi-year contract. Significant value. I kept my expression neutral. They specifically asked for Elena Foster by name, he said. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, I don't work here anymore, Michael. You made that very clear. I let that sit between us for a moment. It had earned its space. I could see him running the calculation in real time. On one side, the authority of the decision he had staged publicly 20 minutes ago, which reversing would require visible retreat his ambitions could not absorb. On the other, a client worth millions a year, calling within minutes of my departure, asking specifically for the person he had just had escorted out. The calculation was not going well for him. Elena, he said, I think we need to talk about what a professional transition looks like here. We should have had that conversation before the security guards, I said. His jaw tightened. I'm trying to find a path forward. The path forward, I said, is that I no longer work here. If Harrington Global wants to reach me, they know how. I picked up my box. I'd suggest someone reviews the integration documentation in the client file before Thursday, I said. specifically the section on the quarterly calibration window. It was due next week. I did not add that no one else in the department would know what that meant. I did not need to. I could see from Michael's face that he understood. He just didn't yet understand how fully. But he was about to. I walked out of the building and sat in my car for about 10 minutes. Not because I was falling apart. I needed the stillness, the transition between what had just happened and what came next. What I felt was not what I expected. There was something that might have been relief. Not at losing the job. That part hurt, the way 12 years of anything hurts when it ends badly. But relief at the simplicity of my position now. For 2 years I had been navigating a complicated organizational situation, always calculating what to say and what to leave unsaid. That was over. I drove to a diner 15 minutes from the office. I ordered coffee and eggs and opened my personal laptop. I sent one email, to Theodore Wills, Harrington Global's head of operations, who had been my primary counterpart for 6 of the 7 years I had managed their account. I told him I had left the company that morning and wanted him to hear it from me before the day got complicated. I gave him my personal contact information and said I was happy to speak if he had questions. I sent it and went back to my eggs. My phone rang 11 minutes later. Theodore Wills spoke for about 4 minutes before I said much of anything. He had been at Harrington for 15 years and had the directness of a person who has decided that time is too valuable for language that dances around the point. He told me what Michael had said on the phone, that my departure was a planned transition, that the systems were fully capable of running without oversight, that the renewal meeting would proceed as scheduled. Theodore told me what he thought about that in language I won't reproduce here, but that was extremely clear. Then he asked me to tell him what was actually true about the state of the Harrington integration. I was precise. I described where the integration stood that morning. I described the calibration window due in 8 days and what would happen if it wasn't run. I described the specific flag I had been monitoring in the reporting pipeline, irregular behavior for 3 weeks that I hadn't yet had a chance to fully investigate. Theodore was quiet for a moment. If that calibration doesn't happen, he said, what does our reporting look like on the 15th? Wrong, I said. Possibly significantly wrong. We need to talk about what happens next, he said. The next 3 days moved quickly. Theodore formally notified the company on Thursday morning, a letter to the VP of Client Operations that I was not copied on but that Theodore summarized for me. Harrington Global was pausing the renewal discussion pending clarification about the operational transition plan. They had identified 3 specific concerns about the current state of their integration. They requested a written response addressing each one. The 3 concerns were the exact items I had described to Theodore. Inside the company, a former colleague I trusted sent me a brief message that afternoon. The VP of Client Operations had gone to Michael directly. Michael had explained that the situation was manageable. The VP had asked him to demonstrate, specifically, how the calibration window would be handled. Michael had taken that question to the most senior technical analyst on the team. The analyst had looked at the official integration documentation and said he would need about a week to fully understand the system before he could confidently run the calibration. The calibration was due in 7 days. I sat with my personal laptop and watched the situation develop from the outside, with the particular clarity that comes from seeing something unfold exactly the way you always knew it would. On Friday afternoon, 2 days after the Escort, the Harrington integration reporting started showing errors. Not large ones initially. The kind of small discrepancies that, if you knew what to look for, were a clear signal of what was developing downstream. If you didn't know the history of the system, they looked like routine noise. Theodore called me that evening. The report we pulled this afternoon has 11 line items that look off, he said. Our finance team flagged it. I asked him to read me the item numbers. I knew immediately what was happening. I walked him through the explanation, the accumulated drift in the approval trigger logic, the interaction with the quarterly batch cycle, the way the errors would compound if the calibration wasn't run correctly and soon. Can you fix it? He asked. I'm not currently employed there, I said. That's not what I asked. I thought about that for a moment. I could advise on a solution remotely, I said carefully. But the actual work would need to be done by someone with system access. What if you had system access? He asked. Theodore had a proposal. I listened to the whole thing before I said anything. By Monday morning, the errors had been flagged internally. The VP of Client Operations had received a direct call from Harrington's CFO. That call had been pointed, words like unacceptable and contractual obligations, and the VP had immediately escalated to the executive team. Within the executive team, questions began moving in a particular direction. Why had the operational lead for this account been removed without a transition plan? Why had written risk assessments, several of them, all documented, all timestamped, been classified as low priority? Why was the technical team now estimating a week to understand a system that should have had clear documentation? Those questions led to a documentation review, which led to my 4 submissions, which led to Michael's responses, which led to a reconstruction of a timeline that was, from what I understood, fairly damning in terms of what it revealed about how those risks had been managed. I was not present for any of those conversations. I did not contact anyone internally. I did not reach out to the executive team. The record spoke for itself. It had always been going to. I had made sure of that, one document at a time, over 12 years. Priya Nair was the VP of Client Operations, and she called me personally. She was professional and direct and didn't waste our time with anything unnecessary. She said the company had completed an internal review of the events surrounding my departure. She said the review had identified concerns with how operational risks had been assessed and communicated within the management structure. She offered me my position back, at a revised compensation level, with direct reporting to her office. I thanked her and said I would need a few days to think about it. What I was thinking about was not primarily the offer. I was thinking about what the offer represented, the recognition that the version of the department Michael had presented to leadership was incomplete, and that the version I had been living inside for 12 years was the real one. That recognition mattered to me. I was also thinking about the conversation with Theodore, about the proposal he had made, about what a different path might look like. I asked Priya one question: what happened with Michael? She was quiet for a moment. His position is currently under review, she said. I thanked her. I said I would be in touch by the end of the week. Michael's departure was announced the following Thursday. I heard about it from my former colleague in a brief message. The announcement used the standard language companies use when someone is removed rather than resigned: organizational restructuring, strategic realignment, grateful for contributions. I read it once and did not read it again. I want to be honest about what I felt, because the easy version of this story has a clean emotional arc that I don't think is accurate. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel that justice had been served in some satisfying and complete way. What I felt was complicated, a recognition that the outcome was correct, that the documentation had done what documentation is supposed to do, and also a genuine sadness about how much unnecessary damage had been caused on the way to that outcome. Clients had experienced disruption. Colleagues had spent a difficult week managing a crisis that didn't need to happen. An organization that had functioned well was put through strain because one person's ambition had overridden their judgment about what they actually understood. That was not a victory. That was a cost. The outcome was the right one. The path to it was wasteful and avoidable. I had said so in writing 4 times. I had been right about that too. I called Theodore back on a Wednesday afternoon, 8 days after the Escort. I told him I had decided not to return to my former employer. He said he thought that was the right call. Then I told him I was interested in continuing the conversation about his proposal. What Theodore had described was a role on Harrington Global's internal team, not a consulting arrangement, but permanent employment managing operational systems across their business divisions. A role with genuine authority over how those systems were designed and maintained. The compensation was significantly higher. The title was senior. The reporting structure placed me directly under the executive operations function rather than under someone building a promotion case. He had said something in that first call that I kept returning to: we've watched you manage our account for 7 years. We've seen how you handle it when things go wrong. We know what we're buying. That was the part that mattered most. After 12 years of invisible work, of building things that functioned so quietly that their existence became arguable, here was someone saying, I see exactly what you do. I know exactly what it's worth. I said yes. 6 months later I walk into an office that has my name on the door. It is a small detail, but I notice it every morning when I arrive. A name on a door is not invisible. It is the opposite of invisible. It is, in its modest way, a declaration. The work is not so different from what I did before. I still manage complex operational systems. I still write documentation that most people will never read until something breaks. I still run morning checks that are invisible when they succeed and critical when they don't. What is different is the context. I work with people who understand that the calm running of a system is not evidence it doesn't need attention. Who know that expertise doesn't become obsolete because the problems it prevents don't happen. Who treat the maintenance of things as work worth doing and worth recognizing. That context changes everything, not dramatically, quietly, the way the right environment changes the quality of everything you produce in it. I think about Michael sometimes. Not often. I think about the moment in the elevator lobby, the first time in 2 years he saw, clearly, what he had actually been looking at all along. He ordered security to escort me out. The building escorted him out instead.